Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Yoma Daf. We begin halfway through the first Amud of Daf Samachay. The Daf will discuss two opinions of Rabbi Yehuda. One very briefly, a kasha and a teretz, and the other much more at length. The Gemara will have a question from a Mishnah in Shkolim to opinion of Rabbi Yehuda on Yom Kippur, and the Gemara will try 5 different resolutions to this question. Now, first of all, we have seen that Rabbi Yehuda has an opinion. He holds that you need to have a pair of the two seirim. They both have to be there. The sar that goes la'azazel and the sar that goes to the carbon chatas both have to stay until the end of the avodah of the other one. And therefore, even if the carbon chatas sire has already been slaughtered and shechted and prepared, and its blood is in a cup until its blood is finished sprinkling, if something happens, if the blood spills, you have to bring a new one, and you have to also replace the azazel because they have to come as a new pair. Same thing for the sar la'azazel. If something happens to it and it does not go la'azazel, you have to bring a new carbon chatas and shechted along with the new sar la'azazel. So the Gemara asks, I understand if the blood spills, you didn't finish the mitzvah. Sprinkling the blood in the Kodesh HaKodashim or in the Heichal is part of the essential mitzvah. If it wasn't performed, it has to be done over again. Once it's done over again, it has to have a new mate. The new azazel has to be brought. But the azazel, the bringing it to the cliff and pushing it off the cliff is not an essential part of the avodah according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that just when it performs the geirul, that's the essential avodah, and anything that happens afterwards is not makev. It's not necessary. If we don't get a chance to do it, it's kosher without it, because those things are not done by the Kohen Gadol in his big day lavan. So the vidoy, it should be said. You should say the vidoy on this side that goes off the cliff. But if it's not said, it's okay. And certainly when you give it to somebody else, the Kohen Gadol hands it off to someone else to take to the cliff to push it off. That's not an avodah. It's ma'akev. It's not a Kohen Gadol avodah. So if it doesn't make it, if something happens to it before then, why do you have to replace it and bring a new sar la'azazel and a new maid, a new carbon chatas? So Gemara says, because there's a different thing that has to be done. It has to do with the Yoma Daf. The Torah says that the sar la'azazel has to remain alive until the avodah of the sar la'chatas is finished. And until that blood is fully sprinkled, the sar la'azazel has to stay. If it is lost and it dies before the blood of the other one is fully sprinkled, it has to be replaced. And therefore, in that moment when we say that it's lost, we mean before the blood of the other one is fully sprinkled, and you have to get a new la'azazel, and you also have to get a new chatas, because you have to do the blood avodah over again. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to the next opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to have a contradiction between two things he says, and that is, if you don't use a carbon or something kaddish that's set aside this year, can you use it next year? So the first quote is from a Mishnah in Masechah Shkolim. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion doesn't appear in the Mishnah there, but it does here. The Mishnah there is discussing what happens if Shkolim aren't used this year, they don't arrive on time this year, and they're replaced, and now you have 2 of them. Can you use the second one for next year? What's the case? So the Mishnah says as follows. People were supposed to send their shkolim to the Beis HaMikdash. Let's say they gave it to a shliach to take to the Beis HaMikdash, and the shliach loses it. He loses it or gets stolen from. Now, he's not responsible for that. He doesn't have to replace it. He wasn't a shomer sachar, he's a shomer chinam. He's not responsible, but he does have to swear that he didn't steal it himself. Who does he swear to? So he swears to whoever takes the loss. Who takes the loss? So the Mishnah says depends at what point it was lost. If it was lost before the withdrawal of shkalim from the collection chest in the Beis HaMikdash ever happened, so then the halacha is that the Yisraelim lose it, because the people who sent it, their shkalim were not included in that withdrawal. That withdrawal is made for every shekel in the box, even the ones that aren't actually in the withdrawal. It's a withdrawal from their shkalim, and therefore they're included in every shekel in the box and every shekel on the way to the box that we're aware of. These shkalim never arrived yet, and we weren't aware of it, and they were lost. Therefore, the Yisraelim didn't have a share in it, and they have to replace it. They have to send new shkalim. If, however, the withdrawal was made later, after it was found out that it was on the way, then the withdrawal is for those shkalim as well, and they don't have to be replaced. It's the Beis HaMikdash that loses it. So, in the first instance, they have to swear to the Yisraelim because they have to send new shkalim. In the second instance, they have to swear to the Beis HaMikdash gizbayr because they take the loss in Yisrael. The Yisraelim don't send new shkalim. Either way, the Mishnah continues and says, what happens if if the shkalim that were lost are then recovered? Let's say they're replaced. Let's say it's a situation in which the Yisraelim had to send a new set. it was not included in the Trumas Halishka. The withdrawal was already performed. They had to send a new set of shkalim. They sent a new set, and then the old set is recovered. Either it was found, or those who stole it returned it. Now those Yisraelim sent 2 full sets. So it's a machlokes what happens with the second set that's now been recovered. According to the Tana Kama, you can't do anything with it. It goes into the box, and the Yisraelim cannot credit it to themselves at all. They have to bring a whole new set next year. According to Rabbi Yehuda, counts towards next year. It's fine for next year. So now the Gemara's kasha is, what do you mean? You're telling me that Rabbi Yehuda says that things brought this year could be counted towards next year, but what's the halacha if you have a par and a sayr, the goat of Yom Kippur, or the par, the cow that the Kohen Gadol needs to buy with his own money to bring as his own kapara for Yom Kippur, if they're lost, and they're replaced with a new one, and then the first one is recovered, and now you have 2. What happens with the second one? So it's a machlekes Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be left to Mesa, it has to be left to die, like any carbon chatas that's replaced. And Rabbi Shimon say no, since it's a public carbon, it could be left to get a mum and then sold and use its money to buy a voluntary korbanos ola. However, Rabbi Yehuda clearly holds that it cannot be used for next year. So the question then is as follows. How come the shkalim that have been replaced, and now we have extra, could be used towards next year, but the par and the sar of Yom Kippur cannot be used towards next year? And the Gemara is going to try 5 different resolutions for this question. The Gemara's first resolution is that karbanos are different than shkalim. Karbanos have a special halacha, said by Rav Tavi in the name of Yeshaya, that it has to be new for each year. It says, the Torah says it should be chodesh b'chodshai, new for each month, l'chodshei hashana. So it uses the word chadash. It has to be new for this year. Special exeris has to be new for this year. So Gemara says, first of all, that only applies to Karbanos Tzibor. That pasuk was only said by Karbanos Tzibor, but the power of the Kohen Gadol is the Karban Yachid, and therefore that would not answer that. Second of all, that halacha is only a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that it should be new for next year. If it's not new, you don't violate any Isser. As a matter of fact, the Gemara quotes a Mishnah that says that the carbon for Chodesh Nisan, which is when the year starts as far as these halachos, so it's supposed to be brought from the shkalim that were brought this month Nisan. If it's brought from last year, it's also good. You missed the mitzvah of bringing new ones. But fine, it's still kasha. So the Gemara's kasha is twofold. Why should this animal, should we say that the par of the Kohen Gadol has to be Mesa? It's not a public carbon, and even the sar is only a mitzvah, so you don't have to make it be Mesa just because you're not fulfilling the mitzvah the right way. You could still use it. So the Gemara wants to say, well, maybe the par is a gzeira, that I might confuse the par with the sar. The Gemara says, even so, it's a gzeira, so it's not a reason for it to be Mesa. It could at least be left to get a mum. Neither of these are a reason to be Mesa. So the Gemara therefore moves on to its next reason, which the Gemara says is that the geirel, the drawing of lots, which was done by the sire, that's canceled at the end of the year. That only sets aside, that only indicates which sar goes for the carbon chatas and which sar goes for azazel for this year. For next year, it doesn't count. So the Gemara says, okay, what's the problem? So do a new geirel. Why aren't you allowed to do a new geirel for next year? So Gemara says, well, there's a gzeira. Maybe people will think that a geirel works for next year. If we use the same ones, people won't realize we did a new geirel, and will think that the old geirel works for the following year. We don't want that to happen. So the Gemara says, okay, even if I'll accept that, that's only true for the sire. That is decided by drawing of lots by the geirel, but the par, there is no geirel. What are you going to say? The Gemara says gzeira. We'll confuse the par and the sar. The Gemara says gzeira is not a reason. This is going to be a refrain that's repeated in all these answers. Gzeira, you're afraid of confusion, is not a reason for it to be Mesa. It's not a reason for it to be left to die. It should be left to get a moment sold. So the Gemara therefore moves on to its next answer. The Gemara says we're afraid that the Kohen Gadol is going to die this year, and then these karbanos chatas won't be able to be used for next year. The Kohen Gadol, it's his personal carbon, and the halacha is that when a personal carbon, when the owner of a personal carbon, when he dies, it's that animal has to be left to Mesa. It can't be used for something else. It can't be used by anyone else. That's at least if it's a carbon chatas. So the Gemara says that's true for the par. The par is a private carbon of the Kohen Gadol. Not true for the sar. Sar is a public carbon, so you don't have that concern. So the Gemara says, okay, I'll give you another. So the Gemara says maybe it's gzeira. The Gemara says no, gzeira is not a reason to have it be left to die, it should still be allowed to get a mum and be sold. So Gemara says, okay, I'll give you another reason, a fourth answer. Maybe we're afraid that the soyer is going to age out. The soyer has to be within its first year of life. By next Yom Kippur, it might be more than a year old. The Gemara says, whoa, hold on a second. First of all, it might be more than a year old. From this, if it's alive this Yom Kippur, by next Yom Kippur, it'll be for sure more than a year old. The Gemara says, not necessarily. Could be that it's 8 or 9 days old now, and we go with the solar year. And therefore, next Yom Kippur is 354 days from now, and 362 or 363 days from now, it'll still be within its first solar year by next Yom Kippur. That is 364 days from its birth. It'll be within its first solar year, because it's 8 days old now. 8 days is the minimum age that it could be. It's 8 days old now. 354 years from now is next Yom Kippur. It'll be 362 days old. It'll be within its first solar year. The Gemara says, because it's a machlokes, Rebbe and the Chachamim, whether we go by the solar year or by the lunar year as far as this halacha. Now the Gemara quotes this machlokes in full. It's a brisa. It's concerning two halachas that Rebbe says we use the solar year. The solar year, Rebbe says, is used for this halacha as far as how old when the animal's first year of life is considered to be over and it's disqualified from karbanis, that it has to be within a year of age. It's also used for the halacha of that if somebody sells a house within a walled city, has a right to redeem it for 1 year. 1 year there goes by the solar year. That's Rebbe. The Rabbanan say no, both of these halachas go by the lunar year, the Jewish year, and if it's a leap year and it's 13 months, so you get an extra month. So now, the Gemara therefore says, so it could be that it'll be over a year. It's not for sure. It's very highly likely it'll be over a year. It's not for sure that it'll be over a year. And therefore, we don't want you to use the soyer next year. So the Gemara says that's good for the soyer, which has to be within a year. It does not explain the par, which could be up to 3 years old. Rishayim Mask has to be within the third year. It can't be older than that. Okay. A question that's asked there, Taisus and several other Rishayim asked that. So the Gemara now moves on to its final answer, which will have some challenges to it. The Gemara says, okay, the reason that we don't want to use it next year is because we don't want to leave a kadosh animal lying around, just wandering around, waiting for a year. We're afraid that something bad's going to happen. There will be a disaster. A takala will happen. So the Gemara says the takala will happen. Okay, what's this takala? And where do we see this takala? So the Gemara quotes a Mishnah that talks about a takala that would happen if you leave kachim around for too long. And the Mishnah says, Bisman hazeh, that there's no Beis HaMikdash, you should not be makdish anything, different types of hektish that the Mishnah speaks about, hektish, erchin, machrimin, all these things you should not do, because you're going to have kaddish things lying around. What should you do if you are makdish it? So if it's an animal, it should be te'oker, which the Gemara explains means you lock it in a room until it dies. If it's clothing or other objects that rot, you leave it until it rots. And if it's money or other kelim made out of metal that don't rot, so you should throw its value into the Yam HaMelech, meaning you should destroy it. You should not leave this kedusha lying around. So the Gemara says, what's the problem? What are we afraid of exactly that we're saying you should not leave these animals, the par and the soyer, lying around? If we're afraid that it'll accidentally be brought as a carbon, as the wrong carbon, so then how is it that there are many halachas throughout Shas where something is left to graze until it gets a mum? How are you allowed to leave it lying around, hanging around until it gets a mum? Maybe you can bring it as the wrong carbon. So Gemara says, well, maybe it's talking about that you can end up working it. You'll end up using a hektish animal, you'll end up working it in the field, or you'll end up sharing its wool. So Gemara says, the same question. How are you allowed to leave it? How are you allowed to leave any of the animals that its halacha is that it has to be left until it gets a mum? How are you allowed to just leave it? So Gemara says, no, those animals are different. Those animals, you're never planning on bringing it as a carbon, so you leave it in the field, you forget about it. When it gets a mum, it gets a mum. But you don't mentally relate to it as a carbon anymore, just as an animal, you're waiting until it gets a mum so you can get rid of it. This, however, is a carbon. You're planning on bringing it next year. Then you may bring it as a carbon earlier accidentally by mistake. That's the takala we're afraid of, and therefore we don't want it hanging around for next year, and you can't leave it for next year, for next Yom Kippur. Says the Gemara, this concern for takala, for something bad happening, for it being brought as a carbon too early, is actually a machlokes tanaim, because we see two prices discussing what happens if you have a carbon Pesach that wasn't brought. It wasn't brought Pesach Rishon, save it for Pesach Sheni. But if it wasn't brought Pesach Sheni, according to one brayso, you could leave it for next year. According to another brayso, you're not allowed to leave it for next year. So probably what they're arguing about is whether we're concerned for a takala or not. Which is not necessarily. Could be they're arguing about the machlokes of Rebbe and the Chachamim. When does its first year end? One holds like Rebbe that its first year ends at the end of its solar year, and therefore next Pesach could still be within a year of life. The other one holds like the Chachamim that we go by the Jewish year, and therefore next Pesach will definitely be over a year old, and it'll have aged out, it'll have expired, and you can't bring it anymore. So Gemara says that's a nice pshat for the machlokes about the animal itself, but we have the same machlokes about money that was set aside to be a carbon Pesach. According to one Brisa, you are allowed to leave that for next year's carbon Pesach, and according to one, you're not. Obviously, that machlokes is about whether we're concerned for tekhallah.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.